Welcome to the Commonwealth Matters. I'm your host, Richard Nelson. One of the pressing questions of the day regards human identity, particularly sexual identity. Is there an inherent right to define one's own identity? And should there be limits to sexual expression of one's identity? Joining us to help unpack this issue and to answer some of these questions is Dr. Carl Trueman, professor at Grove City College in their Department of Biblical and Religious Studies. He's the author of the important book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution. Carl, welcome to the Commonwealth Matters.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on, Rich.
Boy, that title is a mouthful. There's a lot there. And just before we began the program, I really just learned about you maybe less than 2 years ago. Read your book about a year ago and was very, very impressed that you're able to tackle such a large topic, a challenging topic. But again, the title is The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution. Carl, many of the listeners and viewers know that Commonwealth Policy Center has addressed much of the fallout related to the sexual revolution as they relate in the public policy arena, as they relate to politics. And I'm talking about abortion policy. I'm talking about kids that don't have a home because of broken marriages or parents that don't want to raise them. And now we're talking about transgenderism, which is going mainstream, which is a rarely new development. But the idea for your book began with your curiosity about the statement, I am a woman trapped in a man's body, and that somehow that thought has become reasonable in today's society. What's happened in the last few years even to bring this thought into the mainstream? Just a few years ago, Carl, we would have not imagined that that would have been a reasonable thought. And I think you mentioned in your book that if your grandfather had that idea posed to him, he would have found it absurd. My grandfather as well.
Yeah, I think there are a number of factors that play into the story of the success of the transgender lobby. Part of it, I think, is the immediate political story that can be told. The LGBTQ Alliance has proved a remarkably effective political movement, a remarkably effective lobby group, if you like. And the binding together of transgenderism with the rights for lesbian and gay people was a move of political genius, really. We can unpack that perhaps later on. I think it's a marriage of pure convenience in many ways, but it allowed the transgender lobby to piggyback off what was already a pretty well-established, effective political movement. The longer story, I think, is that transgenderism represents I think it represents the manifestation or the latest stage of two particular streams within Western culture. One stream, I think, is the increasing authorization or authority we grant to inner feelings, such that if I feel that I'm a woman, that is who I really am. Our bodies have ceased to be the essence of who we are, and our psychological states have become the essence of who we are. And secondly, I think there's a stream of what one might call broadly transhumanism. And that is that our culture, particularly our technological culture, is very enamored with the transcendence of self, that we see our physical bodies, our physical limitations, something to be transcended. And transgenderism is part of that. And perhaps the more obvious aspects of transhumanism are the talk you get on occasion about, beating mortality or downloading our brains into a computer system or something. These are what we typically associate with transhumanism. I think transgenderism is part of that culture too. It's essentially arguing that the human body is at best raw material out of which we can make ourselves, at worst a hindrance to us being ourselves, and something that needs to be technologically transcended in order to allow full self-realization.
That's a new development, that we look inside ourselves for as far as who we are, instead of looking outside ourselves as to who we are. In your book, Carl, you trace thoughts of the major thinkers in Western history, thinkers like Rousseau, Nietzsche, Marx, Darwin, and Freud, and how their ideas and writings contributed to the idea of the modern self. You did a brilliant job, by the way. I'm going to give you a plug for your book.
Thank you.
It's a thick book. It's academic in many respects, but it is a fantastic book, really doing a good job explaining how we got to where we are. Carl, my question is where were the Christian thinkers at the time of Marx and Darwin and Freud? Was there a Christian response to their ideologies that they were promoting?
Well, I think that's an interesting question. First of all, I would say that Christian thinkers are not immune to the same kind of social conditions that are leading Marx, Darwin, Nietzsche, etc., to reflect on the world around them. I mean, Rousseau might provide a more obvious example. When Rousseau is engaged in his thinking, first and second discourses, and his real wrestling with what is the role of the feelings in constituting who I am. Jonathan Edwards is writing his work on the religious affections. You have the Methodist revivals. So there are broad patterns of history from which Christianity is not isolated, and our own thinkers are responding to similar social circumstances and conditions. When it comes to responses to Marx and Nietzsche, who I think are the key players really in the development of the modern self, what's interesting about Marx and Nietzsche is that they're really far more significant today than they ever were in their own day. So it doesn't surprise me that Christian thinkers in the 19th century and early 20th century are not engaging in great depth or with using tremendous brain power to critique Marx and Nietzsche, because Marx and Nietzsche weren't really forces at that particular point. Marx and Nietzsche became much more significant, I think, as, for want of a better term, philosophers of existence and culture in the 20th century, particularly in the latter part of the 20th century and on into the 21st. So if you're looking at the early 20th century, Herman Bavinck, the Dutch theologian, has a few things to say about Nietzsche here and there, but by and large, these thinkers were not seen to be the threats they have since become in their own day and generation.
Fascinating, fascinating. You say in your book that the framework for identity in wider society is deep-rooted, powerful, and fundamentally antithetical to the kind of identity promoted as basic in the Bible. I think we would agree that the biblical worldview shaped the thinking of the West, not just how we think of ourselves, but it has shaped how we interact with culture, what our role is in culture. Clearly, there were defined roles of men and women. We had an understanding of marriage. But if you could tell us what is the biblical idea of selfhood? Let's start with some basics here. What does the Bible teach about that?
I mean, the most basic thing is that human beings are made in the image of God, and therefore who we are is actually grounded in something that transcends this creation. The idea of developing any fundamental notion of what it means to be a human being that does not take into account the fact that we are created, dependent upon God, both for our being and for the nature of our being, is simply not something that Christians can countenance. We're made in the image of God. Secondly, we're relational beings. We are placed in creation within a network of dependencies and obligations. It's very interesting that in the creation narrative, the only thing that isn't good is the fact that Adam's on his own. He needs a helpmeet. He needs a woman to interact with. Adam truly becomes Adam in a way in the Bible when Eve is created. We tend to think today of ourselves as isolated units. I am me, and I may or may not wish to enter into contractual relationships with other people around me. The Bible doesn't teach that we're like that. The Bible teaches that human beings are born into a network of dependencies, fundamentally upon God, but also towards each other.
Yeah, that's good. So I'm going to go back to transgenderism, and you alluded to this a few moments ago, but in your book, you say that transgenderism prioritizes inner convictions over biological reality, that it separates gender from sex, given that it drives a wedge between chromosomes and how society defines being a man or a woman. Now, transgenderism is being promoted largely by academia. It's our universities, college campuses here in this country. Yet this idea that you can transcend your biological sex, a fixed biological scientific reality, is a contradiction. So how does academia reconcile this contradiction that a man can become a woman, or a woman can become a man, even though the biological categories is objectively true, it's scientifically true?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I think it connects to the grip which certain strands of theory have come to have on particularly humanities departments in institutions of higher education, though it's spreading to other departments too. The idea that being a man or being a woman is a matter of social performance is very deeply embedded in gender theory. Judith Butler, the great grandmother of all gender theorists. I still think Judith Butler is the great gender theorist. Argues that that femininity is essentially a performance. It's a socially constructed performance. It is behaving in a certain way society expects you to behave, mapped somewhat arbitrarily onto the physiological makeup of the body. The biology of the body is made into something significant by the performances that are attached to it. Now, one of the reasons why that grips the imagination is, of course, it contains a certain amount of truth. It's like Christian heresies. The thing that makes Christian heresies powerful and persuasive quite often is the fact that a certain aspect of the truth is present. And it's very clear that there is a degree of performativity in what it means to be a man or what it means to be a woman. Being a man in Texas is very different from being a man in Seoul, South Korea, or being a man in Berlin, Germany, or Cardiff, Wales. We know that the way we think about men and women, what we expect from men and women, there is a decent amount of social constructed expectation there. The sleight of hand, of course, is saying that because aspects of how we construct manhood and womanhood are socially conditioned, socially constructed, therefore, biology has no significance whatsoever. That's the problem. And then when you tie that to a culture where, for example, we now typically think of sex as non-reproductive.
Yeah.
That we tend to think of sex as, we'll talk about, pregnancy is a problem, or pregnancy is an unfortunate side effect of having sex. Once you start to think as a culture about sex as recreation and not as having a central reproductive function, then really the one performance, we might say, of men and women that is distinct and non-negotiable, that is, women get pregnant and gestate. Once that becomes a problem or becomes marginal, then inevitably we find ourselves in a position where highly intelligent people are asked the question, what is a woman? And they are incapable of answering it. So I think what you have is an academic theory that has got legs in the wider culture, partly because of the way we have come to think about women's bodily functions vis-a-vis sex and reproduction at this point in time.
Yeah, that's very good. This issue of transgenderism going mainstream is a real issue here in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, where our state legislature just last week passed a bill into law that would prevent minor children from undergoing hormone therapy or gender transition surgery. And it also prohibits the teaching of LGBT identities in K through 5. It says that the bathrooms in the public schools need to be used by children of the appropriate biological sex, boys in the boys' restrooms, girls in the girls' restrooms, and locker rooms for that matter. And it's gotten a lot of pushback. It is getting a lot of criticism from mainstream media. Academia, the Commissioner of Education in Kentucky harshly criticized that bill. In fact, I debated a couple of activists last night on a public television program, but the pushback is real. And it seems, Carl, to me that objective truth, objective reality is on our side. Those that hold a biblical worldview. That's more of commentary. I want to go into this direction though. You mentioned the sexual revolution, and I find a lot of contradictions with it. As you were talking about pregnancy as being a surprise, like, oh my goodness, a couple has sex and they find themselves pregnant, and instead of it being a joy between a couple, a married couple, it is a burden. It is a crisis. It is something to avoid. But there are other contradictions as well that we see with the sexual revolution. One is that when the sexual revolution was underway, I remember the term 20 some years ago, we were warned about the bedroom police and that nobody should care about what one does in their private personal lives. And now today, sexual identity has become a public badge of honor, if you will. How do you reconcile those two ideas? At one point it's private, don't talk about it, don't even think about it. And now it's an important identity.
Yeah, it is an interesting reversal. I mean, on one level, I'm very sympathetic to wanting to keep the government out of the bedroom. You know, that there's a sense of it's private. And there is also a sense in whatever my neighbors get up to in the privacy of their bedrooms doesn't directly affect me. But of course, there you're talking about behavior. There you're talking about behavior between consenting adults. When you move into the realm of what we're facing today, we're talking about identity. Now, it's not that those two things are unconnected, but the political discourse about sex is not sex about behavior. It's sex conceived of as identity. And once you start to think that your identity is grounded in your desires, then it's not what's going on in the bedroom that is the most important thing. It's whether you're allowed to express those desires as legitimate in public that comes down to whether you're allowed to be yourself in public.
Yeah.
The difference might be this, you know, to point to what I'm thinking about here. There's homosexuality as sexual activity, and there's homosexuality as desire. I was talking to somebody in the last 12 months who commented to me that once upon a time they'd been bi and now they're straight. And it was clear to me as I talked to this person that I didn't think they'd ever had any sexual experience in their life. They were simply talking about their inner feelings and the direction they felt that their sexual desire was going in. Once you say that sexual desire is identity, then laws about how you can express that sexual desire cease to be laws about behavior and become laws about who is and is not a legitimate person. And that's why, you know, the most private act that usually occurs between two people is now one of the biggest public policy issues in the West, because we've switched from sex as behavior and laws that were built around sex as behavior to thinking of sex as identity.
Wow, that's fascinating. If you're just joining us, you're listening to the Commonwealth Matters. I'm Richard Nelson, Executive Director of the Commonwealth Policy Center, here with Carl Trueman, who wrote an important book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to unpack Dr. Trueman's comment in just a moment, so stick with us. Welcome back to the Commonwealth Matters. I'm Richard Nelson with the Commonwealth Policy Center, here with Carl Trueman, author of The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. Carl, what you said just before the break really registered with me, because last night I was debating the director of Kentucky's largest LGBT rights organization, the Kentucky Fairness Campaign, and then a representative from the ACLU. And we were defending that the debate was largely over whether or not the state legislature should have enacted a law that would prevent hormone therapy, puberty blockers, and transition surgeries of minors in the Commonwealth. And the opposition kept coming back to the point, or trying to make the case, that you are erasing them you are trying to deny that they exist, you are harming them, even leading some to suicide. I don't think that the science or the surveys or any of it bears out what they were saying, but it does hit an important point where there has been a move from sex as a behavior to sex as an identity. And I want to go back to where the transgender movement is right now. And that is to the point where we're told that children should be able to determine their own gender. I listened to a state senator last week testified that she and her husband believe that their 2-year-old, I'm going to repeat, a 2-year-old was identifying with the opposite biological sex. Is this the end? Is this a bridge too far for most Americans? Are they waking up to this reality? Are they saying that this is just nuts, for lack of a better way of putting it?
There are certainly signs that that's the case. I mean, the thing about transgenderism, as opposed to other LGB issues, is that transgenderism is going to affect everybody because it comes with demands about pronouns in the workplace. It comes with demands about destroying women's private spaces. Yeah, it's taking on a lot of enemies in the culture. It's taking on women's sports. Personally, I regard that as a relatively, sports to me, they're entertainment, they're relatively trivial. But on the other hand, they're very important to some people. So it's going to be very, very difficult to avoid transgenderism. It's not a case of, well, I don't mind it as long as it's not in my backyard. This is going to be in everybody's backyard. So it is going to be changing the lives of an awful lot of people. Secondly, I think it is so counterintuitive that it has an inherent implausibility to it. Thirdly, I think most people know that children are impressionable, children are often confused, and children need to be protected from making decisions that are going to change the rest of their lives. It's why there is no state in the United States, from the last time I looked, which was 48 hours ago, I think, there is no state in the United States that allows a child under 18 to get a tattoo. Why? Because we don't want them to permanently mark their skin. Now, trust me on this, a tattoo of a mermaid on a 10-year-old's chest is considerably less damaging than the removal of ovaries, the injection of alien hormones, the removal of sex organs. Yeah, bottom line is, we intuitively know that kids have to be protected from the cells. What we have at the moment are, I would say, evil lobby groups pushing a particular agenda, and naive, frightened, or well-meaning parents who don't have the knowledge to resist what's going on. And I think that's the problem. I'm relatively optimistic in the long run that we will see a big reversal on transgender issues. A couple of things make me optimistic on that front. One, I think we will see more and more detransitioner narratives coming out. Nobody wants trans kids to suffer. Nobody wants trans kids to kill themselves. My heart breaks when I hear some of the testimonies of these kids who are so confused. We need to be compassionate to them. My problem is that the solutions being proposed by the activists don't actually solve the problem. The suicide rate is not appreciably affected by transition. And I think what we'll see over a long period of time is that transitioning is not solving the problem. And I think we'll start to get more detransitioner narratives. Tragically, this will come at huge human cost. But ultimately, we will have a critical mass of detransitioner narratives that will tip things in the right way. The second way I think you could change is this. This is America. Money talks. The pharmaceutical, and I'm not a big pharmaceutical industry conspiracy theory guy, but it is a fact that the pharmaceutical industry is making lots and lots of money out of the trans issue. I think if you could get legislation passed that lifted the statute of limitations on suing pharmaceutical companies and medical centers over trans treatment, you would see a sea change in attitude, maybe overnight, certainly within a very short period of time. Because if these people who know the science is bogus, think that they could be sued 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the line, they're going to be a whole lot more cautious about doing it. And I would just add as a third thing, there's part of me that says, if you're a 25-year-old and you think you're a woman trapped in a man's body and you want to transition, part of me says, I disagree with you. I don't think it's going to solve your problem, but it's a free country. If you pay for it, your insurance company pays for it, that's fine. When it comes to minors and children, we have a moral obligation, not just as Christians, but as ordinary, decent human beings and citizens, to protect kids from themselves. And that's why we must not be intimidated into silence by these very aggressive, very well organized, and very well funded lobby groups.
Very good. We're running out of time. I want to go back to the sexual revolution. You said something profound in your book, that pornography is part of the sexual revolution. Well, that's the obvious part. But the triumph of pornography is both evidence of the death of God and one of the means by which he is killed. And yet porn is everywhere in our society. Pornhub is this website that has all kinds of traffic, taking in all kinds of money. So here's the question, very briefly. Does pornography need to be put to death for the reality of God to be brought back to life in our culture? If pornography can, and I'm saying that in figurative terms, pornography led to the death of God. It is, I think it was a play off of what Nietzsche was saying. They killed God, right? The secularists, atheists kill God. Well, pornography is killing human beings. It is objectifying us. It is desensitizing us. It is doing great harm to us. So does something have to be done with pornography for the reality of God to be brought back to life in our culture?
At a theoretical level, I would say absolutely. Practically, how do you do that? That's very difficult. But certainly, I think restrictions on pornography are important. Legally, how you do that, technologically, how you do that, I don't know in this world. It's not my area. One thing I would say, though, is this. We need to start thinking about pornography less as a First Amendment freedom of speech and freedom of expression issue, and more as a public health crisis. Yeah. I think if we can shift the debate away from, well, hey, we can't censor pornography because that's a restriction of First Amendment rights, we're always going to lose that argument. If we can start pointing to the very serious damage that is being done to bodies and to minds by pornography, maybe we stand a chance of being able to present a plausible legislative case for restrictions on pornography. The pornography on the web today, it's not your grandfather's pornography. Playboy wouldn't even register now. It's often violent, it's depraved, it involves real suffering to real people. It's connected to the sex trafficking industry. I have pastor friends who tell me they're dealing with young men of 14, 15 who have erectile dysfunction because they're so addicted to pornography, they can't respond to a real girlfriend or a real woman in any natural way. So I think we need to shift the public imagination on pornography away from freedom of speech and expression and towards public health crisis.
Yeah, that's a good word. We are out of time. Dr. Carl Trueman, it has been a joy talking with you. I'm looking forward to your next book. I don't know, are you working with on any projects right now?
I got 2 projects on the go. I'm doing a book on the origins of critical theory for Broadman and Holman. And for Sentinel, I'm doing a book on nihilism in modern culture.
I'm looking forward to both of them. Would you do an interview with us when those books come out?
Absolutely.
We'd love to have you. Well, God bless. Thank you so much for your time. God bless and keep up the good work.